Alright, I'm warning you right now, this one is dark. History has handed us pandemics, nuclear disasters, wars, and genocides. None of it is comfortable to look at, but pretending it didn't happen has never helped anyone. The upside is that we always learned something. Sometimes the lesson came slowly, sometimes it came at a terrible cost, but it came nonetheless. So today, we're not here to stare into the darkness for the sake of it. We're here to understand what it left behind. I'm Mike with List 25, and here, in no particular order, are 25 of the darkest moments in history we can all learn from. 25. The Cambodian Genocide. Pol Pot wanted to remake society from scratch, and the plan was so extreme that everyday life collapsed almost overnight. Cities were emptied, families were ripped apart, and anyone with an education, a foreign language, or even a pair of glasses suddenly had a target on their back. In less than 4 years, close to a quarter of the population was gone, either due to starvation, overwork, disease, or mass killings. The world's reaction didn't exactly help either. Cold War politics made everyone hesitate, and that silence cost lives. Cambodia's long climb back forced a lot of nations to rethink what sovereignty means when a government is turning on its own people. It also showed how much damage fanatical ideology can do when no one steps in soon enough. 24. The Black Death. When the Black Death reached Europe in the 1340s, life changed almost immediately. Ships pulled into port with half their crew already gone, and within weeks the infection was running through cities, farms, and trade routes with no pattern anyone could make sense of. People blamed the air, the water, outsiders, even the weather, because the real cause was hidden in fleas and rats that no one paid attention to. Entire families disappeared between one harvest and the next. The strange part is how society changed once the worst was over. With so many workers missing, ordinary people suddenly had leverage, and economic systems had to adjust. Towns started enforcing early versions of quarantine, and rulers finally realized that disease control mattered just as much as defense. 23. The Syrian Civil War and the Humanitarian Crisis. If you've been following what's happened in Syria over the last few years, you'll know it's impossible to pretend these conflicts stay contained. What started out as peaceful protests in 2011 turned into a war that completely changed how countries approach chemical weapons, not to mention refugee protection. The conflict split into so many factions that even Syrians lost track of who controlled which street. And you'd expect that kind of chaos to wake governments up, but instead, foreign powers piled in with their own agendas, turning the country into a battleground of rival interests. Chemical attacks shook the world. ISIS grew in the vacuum, and ancient sites from Aleppo to Palmyra were left wounded, with entire sections lost, and others barely holding on. 22. The 2004 Indian Ocean Tsunami. On December 26, 2004, people all along the Indian Ocean were going about their day when the seas started pulling back. Boats tipped over, reefs appeared, and most people went to take a better look, not realizing that a 9.1 earthquake had just hit near Sumatra. The waves that followed hit country after country with enough force to wipe out entire neighborhoods. Indonesia took the worst of it, but Sri Lanka, India, Thailand, and several others were also devastated. More than 225,000 people died, and a lot of communities lost everything they depended on in a single day. Getting help into those areas was almost impossible at first because the roads, bridges, and boats were gone. That disaster showed how unprepared the region was for something this big. Afterward, countries finally built a proper warning system and started teaching coastal communities what to look for when the ocean behaves like that. Scientists also pointed out that places with wealthy mangroves and coral reefs held up better, which changed how countries planned for future tsunamis. 21. The year the world went dark. If you want to know how it came to be that we worry about things like changing temperatures, climate shocks, and crop failures, look no further than the year 536 CE. That year, people went to bed in a normal world and woke up to something completely different. The sun still rose, but it barely gave off any light. At noon, it looked washed out and weak, and there was a fog that never lifted. Across much of the northern hemisphere, temperatures dropped sharply. Harvests failed and hunger spread through large parts of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia because crops simply did not grow the way they should. Modern science eventually traced it back to a massive volcanic eruption in the north that filled the atmosphere with ash. The darkness dragged on for more than a year and was followed by even more eruptions and a devastating wave of the plague. 20. The Nanking Massacre. When Japanese forces captured Nanking in December 1937, the city fell into a level of violence that still shocks historians. Over 6 weeks, soldiers carried out mass executions, widespread assaults, and looting throughout the former capital. International observers who stayed behind documented bodies along the riverbanks and entire neighborhoods emptied of survivors. There was some help. For example, the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone did their best to shelter some of the civilians, but they were simply overwhelmed by the scale of what was happening. Hundreds of thousands of people died, so much so that the massacre ultimately influenced the post-war trials that helped define modern war crimes law. The records left behind remain some of the most detailed civilian accounts of mass violence in the 20th century. 19. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Chernobyl is the reason nuclear accidents stopped being seen as somebody else's problem. The 1986 explosion did not stay inside the plant, or even inside Ukraine. Radiation drifted across borders, across Europe, and it triggered alarms in countries that didn't even know the accident had happened. The Soviet government stayed quiet at first, which meant people were being exposed to radiation without any warning at all. By the time the world pieced it together, entire communities had been evacuated, and the long-term health problems are already underway. Dozens of people died in the first few months. Thousands of children developed thyroid cancer in the years that followed, and health agencies are still monitoring the people who lived through it. Chernobyl makes sure nobody ever treats a nuclear accident as a local issue again. International reporting, cross-border alerts, and real-time data sharing now all form part of the standard playbook. 18. Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution. When it kicked off in 1966, it was sold as a cleansing of old ideas. However, what people got instead were mobs of students dragging teachers into the streets, libraries burned, temples smashed, and whole families destroyed because someone accused them of being too bourgeois, shorthand at the time for intellectuals, professionals, or anyone seen as socially privileged. Even top officials weren't safe. People were beaten, jailed, or disappeared, and the country's schools, economy, and basic trust in each other disappeared in an instant. That decade taught the world something we rarely say out loud. When you destroy your own experts, you set your country back for decades. Modern China's obsession with education and tech didn't come out of nowhere. It came from surviving a time when the smartest people in the room were treated like enemies. 17. The drying of the Aral Sea. Once the fourth largest lake in the world, the Aral Sea disaster started as a Soviet mega project. Grow more cotton, export more cotton, and don't worry about the consequences. The two rivers feeding the lake ended up being drained so heavily that the sea pulled back, leaving rusted ships stranded in sand and whole regions poisoned by airborne salt. Health problems exploded, and the local economy collapsed with the waterline. But the fallout led to something rare in the region: cooperation. After the Soviet breakup, the Central Asian republics had no choice but to work together on water use, conservation, and basic survival. The collapse forced everyone to realize how quickly borders stop mattering when a resource flows through multiple countries. Without it, the whole region goes down together. 16. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The scale of destruction in Hiroshima and Nagasaki changed the conversation in the space of a few heartbeats, because suddenly, the threat wasn't theoretical anymore. The firestorms, the radiation burns, the mass graves, everything that followed showed the world that atomic weapons don't end wars. They annihilate societies. Roughly 140,000 people in Hiroshima and 70,000 in Nagasaki died by the end of 1945. Thousands more developed leukemia, thyroid cancers, and lifelong radiation injuries. That horror pushed countries into talking to each other, signing agreements, and putting serious limits on nuclear stockpiles. What's worrying is how quickly those hard-earned lessons faded from our collective memory. Countries are now walking away from treaties that once kept the peace, and behaving as if nuclear policy is just another piece on the political chessboard, instead of the thing that once basically erased 2 cities off the map. 15. The Partition of India. Partition exposed just how quickly political language can turn into real-world bloodshed. When India was split into India and Pakistan in 1947, the new border ran through provinces where families, languages, and cultures had been mixed for centuries. The moment that line was announced, the world's largest migration kicked off. 15 million people ran for safety in both directions. 1 million died, and the violence reached a level that even journalists fresh from Europe said was worse than what they saw after the war. That trauma baked mistrust into the region's politics. India and Pakistan still treat each other as if they're living in the shadow of that year, and both countries built their political stories around the idea that the other side can't be trusted. 14. The Toba Catastrophe. We are far more closely related than we act. When your whole species once fit into something the size of a small town, it's a little ridiculous how easily we forget we're all cousins. The Toba Catastrophe was a supervolcanic eruption that scientists place at roughly 75,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries, in the region we now call Indonesia. Nobody knows exactly how many people died during the volcanic winter that followed, but researchers can estimate how many made it through. Some of the more controversial models suggest that the surviving population may have dropped to somewhere between 3 and 10,000 people, which means our species may have come dangerously close to disappearing. Even though this didn't happen during any period covered by written records, we do know that groups living in Africa escaped most of the impact, while populations in Europe and Asia took the hardest blow. 13. The Mongol Conquests. When the Mongols swept through a region, the population could fall by half within a single generation. Northern China, Persia, Central Asia, and large sections of Eastern Europe went through collapses that were closer to extinction events than normal warfare. Baghdad, for example, had been a world center for science, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. In 1 week, it went from the intellectual capital of its age to a smoking wreck. The genetic fallout is just as grim. Millions of men never passed anything on because they didn't survive those campaigns, which is why so many male lineages today trace back to a tiny group of Mongol rulers. It's one of the clearest reminders of how much damage a single era of violence can leave behind. The human cost was so high, you can see it in the climate record. With so many fields abandoned and so many communities gone, vegetation took over huge areas of land, and global temperatures dipped. That data still influences climate models today. 12. The colonization of the Americas. When Europeans showed up in the Americas, the population went from tens of millions of people to scattered survivors in barely a century. Most didn't die in battle. They died from smallpox, measles, flu, and infections their body had never encountered before. It's one of the bleakest chapters in human history because the people who lived here weren't overpowered. They were overwhelmed by biology. What we did learn, at least eventually, is that isolated communities deserve space, not interference. Governments now protect uncontacted tribes from outside contact because we finally have accepted how vulnerable those groups can be. 11. World War I. World War I is one of those events people flatten into trench photos and old maps, but the numbers tell a far uglier story. Serbia lost so many people that some towns never recovered. The Ottoman Empire, Romania, and huge parts of Eastern Europe were gutted. Russia lost millions, and the empire broke apart under the weight of it. By the time the fighting stopped, around 37 million people were dead or wounded. Whole governments had collapsed, and the world had burned itself down because a handful of leaders were convinced they could win a fast, clean war. There was nothing clean about it. Modern diplomacy, international law, and the expectation that nations talk before they shoot all started here. The world learned the price of arrogance the hard way. 10. The 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 was the deadliest outbreak in recorded history. A virus that first appeared in military camps and ports spread across every continent within months, infecting roughly 500 million people. According to statistics, close to 100 million may have died, and in many countries, the flu killed more civilians than World War I. Some places tried quarantines. Others ignored the warnings and paid for it. Philadelphia held a parade that turned into a mass casualty event within a week. St. Louis shut everything early and kept its death rate dramatically lower. The scale of the disaster compelled researchers to build the foundation of virology as a field. It pushed governments to invest in tracking diseases, standardizing reporting, and eventually developing the first flu vaccines in the decades that followed. But in 1918, with no vaccine and no antiviral drugs, the only real tools were masks, ventilation, and luck. Even with that, the virus still reached remote Alaskan villages and killed almost everyone there. 9. The Armenian Genocide. In 1915, the Ottoman government decided Armenians were a threat and moved to eliminate them. Deportations began in the spring, and by the time they ended, 664,000 to 1.2 million people were found dead. Families were driven into the desert with no supplies. Villages were emptied. Children were taken and raised in households that erased their identity. Survivors ended up scattered in camps, carrying whatever was left of their lives. Calling it a tragedy doesn't even come close. The scale of what happened is why we even have a word for this kind of crime. The outrage pushed Americans to launch the first large-scale humanitarian relief effort of the 20th century, and it influenced the people who later created the legal tools used to prosecute genocide. 8. The Cambodian Vietnamese famine. This crisis barely appears in popular histories, but its impact was enormous. After Vietnam removed the Khmer Rouge in 1979, Cambodia faced a country without functioning farms, tools, seeds, draft animals, or irrigation systems. Years of forced labor and sabotage basically wrecked the country's agricultural infrastructure. Roads were mined, fields were abandoned, and the population was already weakened from starvation under the previous regime. Hundreds of thousands died before international aid could stabilize the food supplies, partly because global politics blocked support. A lot of countries also refused to recognize the new Cambodian government, which slowed relief efforts at the exact moment people needed help most. 7. The slave trades. The three largest slave trades didn't just run at the same time, they overlapped and fed off the same basic idea: people were a resource. The Atlantic trade pushed about 12.5 million Africans onto ships headed to the Americas. The Arab and Indian Ocean trades moved another 10 to 18 million people, and while it's less talked about, North Africa's Barbary states captured over 1 million Europeans between the 1500s and 1800s. Each system stopped for different reasons. Britain and other navies hunted down Atlantic slave ships. International treaties slowly choked off the Indian Ocean routes, and the Barbary trade finally ended when countries refused to pay ransoms and shut down corsair ports by force. Looking at them side by side gives you a clear through line. Every one of these trades thrived when governments allowed private profit to outrank human rights. We now have international laws against forced labor, naval patrols targeting trafficking networks, UN conventions, and strict bans on transporting people across borders without documentation. These slave trades provide the historical data we use today to track missing populations, forced migration routes, and labor exploitation. That same data also proved that you can end a slave trade on paper, but the demand for it doesn't necessarily disappear. 6. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill. The Deepwater Horizon rig exploded on April 20th, 2010 and sank, killing 11 people and leaving a well leaking oil into the Gulf for almost 3 months. About 134 million gallons of crude oil ended up in the sea, coating wetlands, wiping out wildlife, and shutting down the fishing and tourism sectors across several states. The extent of the damage demanded a reckoning. Federal investigators documented equipment failures, ignored warnings, and safety system that didn't work when it mattered. That pushed the government to overhaul offshore drilling rules and pushed companies to upgrade everything from blowout preventers to inspection procedures. BP's more than $60 billion in penalties still hold the record for a corporate disaster in the United States, and it set new expectations for how companies respond when they damage an ecosystem. 5. World War II. Between 1939 and 1945, a total of 60 to 70 million people were killed, and civilians died in unprecedented numbers. Cities like Tokyo and Dresden were burned from the sky. Leningrad starved for years. Whole regions of Europe and Asia were reduced to rubble. When the fighting finally stopped, the world had to face the dark reality that nuclear weapons had arrived, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki proved exactly what they could do. The aftermath required countries to redesign how the international system worked. The United Nations was created to keep conflicts from spiraling. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights came out of the world's disgust with what had been done to civilians. NATO was built around collective security. And the nuclear age pushed governments to negotiate arms controls, because everyone understood that a third world war would be the last. 4. The Holocaust. The darkest part of the Second World War will always be the Holocaust, also called Hashoah, Hebrew for the catastrophe. It was the systematic attempt by Nazi Germany to wipe out Europe's Jewish population. 6 million Jews were murdered, along with millions of Romani people, disabled people, Polish civilians, Soviet prisoners of war, LGBTQ victims, and political prisoners. I won't say more about this event, it has been covered enough. But it was all done because the regime defined Jews as an enemy that did not deserve to live. The Holocaust taught us that evidence matters. Survivors' testimonies, camp records, transport lists, and photographs became the blueprint for how the world now documents mass violence. It showed that if you don't preserve the proof, someone will try to rewrite the story. 3. The ongoing sixth mass extinction. We are currently in what many scientists describe as the sixth mass extinction, a human-driven biodiversity crisis. Habitat loss, rising temperatures, pollution, and poaching have hit wildlife from every direction. The World Wildlife Foundation's long-running surveys show just how severe the drop has been. Vertebrate populations have fallen by roughly 68% since 1970. And then we have cases like Sudan, the last male northern white rhino, who died in 2018 at the age of 45. There are only 2 females left in the world, meaning no natural future remains for them. Sudan actually spent his final years surrounded by guards, which is a pretty clear sign of just how far things have gone. When a species disappears, it takes its genetics and its role in an ecosystem with it. The one encouraging part is that we finally understand the size of the problem. Countries are now working toward protecting 30% of land and sea by 2030, and some conservation projects have already shown real results. The message is not complicated. If we do not change how we live, the global extinction rate will keep climbing. 2. The Great Depression. It started with the US stock market crash in October 1929 and spread like wildfire. Factories closed, banks folded and took people's savings with them, and a quarter of the American workforce ended up unemployed. Global trade collapsed. In the Dust Bowl states, drought and ruined soil pushed thousands of families off their land. Other countries were hit just as hard, and the chaos helped extremist movements gain ground, especially in Germany. The fallout reshaped how modern economies work. The United States built the New Deal, launched public works jobs, rewrote banking rules like Glass-Steagall, and created Social Security and unemployment insurance. Economists argued that governments had to step in when private markets crashed, and that idea stuck. After the war, the IMF and World Bank were set up with these lessons in mind. Deposit insurance restored trust in banks, and leaders realized that economic collapse can fuel political extremism. Much of today's safety net exists because the 30s pushed everyone to rethink what a stable economy should look like. 1. The Crusades. If anything, the Crusades taught us how quickly religion can become a tool for political ambition. The First Crusade set the tone. In 1099, European armies captured Jerusalem after a brutal siege and killed large numbers of Muslims and Jewish civilians inside the city. Medieval chroniclers described a massacre, And although the exact death toll is debated, the violence was extensive. When Saladin retook Jerusalem in 1187, he allowed most people to leave after paying a ransom, though those who could not afford it were enslaved. Over time, 9 major crusades and a long list of smaller campaigns pulled in France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, Byzantine Greece, Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia, costing hundreds of thousands of lives and shifting control of the region again and again. The Crusades also left behind early examples of diplomatic agreements, prisoner exchanges, and negotiated safe conduct across enemy territory. Those records shaped parts of what eventually became the laws of war and helped to build the argument that faith cannot be used as a license for unlimited brutality. And that's a wrap. Thank you for spending your time with me. I appreciate you more than you will ever know. But before you go, let me know in the comments what you think the darkest moment in history is. And hopefully we can, or have, learned from it. And if you're not done yet and want to keep the momentum going, check out our related video, 25 Dark Historical Secrets Kept Out of the Classroom. These are the stories that never make it into the textbooks, probably because they scare half the class. That link's going to appear right about here. And as always, like I said, thank you guys so much for watching, even when I cover the dark stuff. Don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, click the notification bell so you don't miss out on any new content, and I'll see you next time.